Philip is the co-founder of Animal Rebellion New York City, and he serves as North American liaison to the global organization. He's a longtime Buddhist practitioner and a founding member of the Buddhist Action Coalition, where he was successful in enacting a plant-sourced food policy, and more recently founded a Buddhist vegan organization, Ahimsa Dharma Anti-speciesist Action. Philip lives in the greater New York City area with his wife, Anne O'Grady Murphy, and any number, it says in his bio, of rescue greyhounds. And maybe he'll tell us what that number is now. So that's it for me. Thank you, Philip. We're really looking forward to hearing this. Thank you so much for coming.
Tracy, thanks so much for inviting me to come speak to this, what sounds like it's going to be a wonderful series, and I'm honored to be the inaugural speaker of the Talks for a Compassionate Future. What a wonderful topic. And I guess I'll say first, it's really wonderful, especially to be here with Animal Rebellion, Ireland. As you can probably tell by my surname, I'm of Irish descent, and I was raised in what we call the first Irish city west of Cork in Boston, Massachusetts. Just thinking, coming onto the call, you know, the list of the guys that I grew up with running around, my buddies, it's like calling roll at the Dales, you know, Murphy, Finnegan, Halligan, Shaughnessy, McBride, O'Neill, you know, so I'm very comfortable speaking with my people, and I know not everyone's from Ireland, but I muted myself. Sorry. It's a special treat for me to be here with you, given my personal history. And with regard to the greyhounds, before I jump in, I'm sitting in my living room. I'm actually between New York City and Philadelphia, and orient to both cities. And most of my activism is in New York. But if straight ahead is 12 o'clock on the clock, at 1, 5, and 10, I have a greyhound at each position calmly resting for now. So we'll see if someone comes to the door, there could be a ruckus. But frankly, if it's amenable to everyone else, I'm actually happy to have them be engaged, because, you know, their lives are a big part of what we're talking about today. Beyond and specifically, and I'll get into this in more detail, but, you know, a plant-based food system is going to be crucial to address the climate and ecological emergency that Tracy addressed. And that's a key pillar of Animal Rebellion. But the anti-speciesist piece, which is what I'm going to speak about more specifically, you know, my guys here are not included in, their lives aren't touched by a plant-based food system, for example. So that's also very significant. And again, and I appreciate Tracy saying, you know, it's a topic that a lot of people aren't familiar and consequently aren't necessarily comfortable with. So trying to hopefully educate, provide something of an education and an engaged dialogue on the topic as we move through our time together. So I'm going to jump now into, I have a slide deck, so I'm going to share my screen and oh, sorry, I didn't reverse to the beginning. Sorry about that. So again, the topic of our conversation tonight, the anti-speciesist imperative of Animal Rebellion. So before we start, I'm going to ask that you join me in a moment of silence in remembrance of the billions of sentient beings relegated to commodity status who live lives of unremitting suffering, and for the millions of those individuals who will lose their life during the course of our time together today. So just a moment of silence together, please. Thank you. So, sorry, I want to make sure I have my screen share. So, this is these are talking points or concepts, I should say, that I think are kind of provide a context for why anti-speciesism is so critically important, you know, to realize that we are all sentient beings, not just human beings, certainly human beings, but all sentient beings are, by being sentient, are members of the moral community, and that we are in this together, and that solidarity of all sentient beings is absolutely crucial to creating a world that is more compassionate and more, you know, loving, and that involves mutual aid. And these are key concepts of another term, frankly, that is misunderstood in similar ways that that speciesism, and that's anarchism. It is not chaotic and not simply a free-for-all, but you know, that's another topic. We could drill maybe on a future talk on that topic of anarchism. But the commonality of solidarity and mutual aid are just key kind of framing concepts that I wanted to share that will inform my talk. So because speciesism is a term that is not familiar to some people, I you know, grabbed a definition that I thought was good and simple at the same time, from Merriam-Webster: prejudice or discrimination based on species, especially discrimination against animals. And I would add to that, especially against animals who are commodified for food, entertainment, clothing, and the like in our, you know, and that is so deeply normalized, as we all know. We were all raised, I speak about a global speciesist culture. And I think that's an important point to touch on at the outset, because it's true. And I've found that it also helps me in my activism to be more emotionally equanimous and less frustrated and angry when people might not kind of get what we're saying, our messages as Animal Rebellion, for example, because, you know, people don't breed, use, and kill animals because they're, you know, they're psychopaths. They do it because it's normalized in our speciesist culture, and that as a way to kind of ground myself as well, I say things to people. I will say, you know, I've consumed animal products longer than I have not consumed them in my life. And that's just hearing myself say it now. It's very humbling. And at the same time, in that way, I think very grounding. So I think that is important. And again, the second part of the definition, the assumption of human superiority. So this speciesism is rooted in human supremacy. You know, the idea that we are separate from the world in which we live, and that we have you know, unbridled dominion over the world as human beings. And I would argue that our current situation with the climate and economic emergency, and more broadly, just our global, you know, political, socioeconomic, and political systems are revealing to us the folly of that idea of human superiority. So this is a quote from an article referencing a very impactful study, and many of you may be familiar with this study by Porin Nemechek in 2018. And the header, it is a speciesist exploitation, not the only one, but with regard to climate and economic emergency, it is very telling. This study is important because it's the largest meta-analysis to date ever done on food, where and how it's produced, and the impacts of that food production on the climate. And this article is from Damian Carrington, who some of you may know is as a reporter for The Guardian, and does a lot of environmental. He's kind of their environmental guy, reporter. And when in writing about this study, he interviewed Joseph Poor, who I had the pleasure to meet at a VegFest UK event in London. And he said, a vegan or plant-based diet is the single biggest way to reduce environmental impact. Single biggest way. And I think this is so important for us as animal justice and climate activists and climate justice activists to underscore these points, because they are not intuitive. They are not widely shared in my experience. And because of the speciesist conditioning that I referred to earlier, there tends to be, in my experience, a lot of resistance to this information. And that's got to be skillfully, addressed as activists by all of us. So, Extinction Rebellion. Tracy had mentioned Animal Rebellion, Ireland having kind of been birthed from an Extinction Rebellion group, local group. And as it turns out, that is actually the case on the macro level, if you will. That's how Animal Rebellion came into to being, and I'll come to that in my later slides. But so from those of you who aren't familiar with Extinction Rebellion, very quickly, and I'm sure many of you are, so climate justice movement, and there was a public launch in November in the UK, and it is out of the UK, and generated an extraordinary amount of media attention. I think they were very skillful in utilizing the media, being very thoughtful based on a lot of research into how mass movements operate effectively. I'm thinking particularly about Roger Hallen, is one of the co-founders, who is an academic is a PhD in that field of study. So movement studies is how I think about it broadly. Key factors: nonviolent direct action, limiting to 3 very concise but aggressively stated demands on government transparency, a dramatic reduction target for global emissions. Notably, that demand has changed from a very specific net zero by 2025 to a more broader mandate, and halting the loss of biodiversity, which is a new addition. When the demands were first stated, I like to think that Animal Rebellion had a hand in that, pointing to the crucial role of animal agriculture as being a key contributor to this loss of biodiversity. But that is a new addition since the demands were originally published. And then direct democracy through citizens' assembly to address these specific issues. So, and yet, hearkening back to the Poor and Nemechek study, despite the fact that a plant-sourced food system would be the greatest positive impact in addressing the climate and ecological emergency, there is no reference to animal agriculture, so-called animal agriculture, in Extinction Rebellion. And in my personal experience, I was at the very first meeting of Extinction Rebellion in New York City with about, I'd say probably 30 people in the room, was active originally with that organization, and frankly was disillusioned by the fact that not only was my having brought to the attention of the group the impact of animal agriculture on the climate and on the ecosystem, and in gatherings, making a simple request at gatherings. There was a lot of community building through like potluck meals, and the request that those meals be plant-based were met with, frankly, a lot of hostility. And I think to Extinction Rebellion's credit, a mitigating factor, it all happened. The spread, the launch and spread of Extinction Rebellion and later Animal Rebellion as well was very rapid. There was a lot of kind of, building the plane as it's being flown. So I think there was a lot of concern about trying to keep a singular focus and not become just another organization doing demonstrations and what have you, being, really carving out a unique niche as a nonviolent direct action organization, targeting government. So in the defense of Extinction Rebellion, I can understand the kind of thinking, but it left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, myself included. And so to just move on to Animal Rebellion. So, and some of you may know this story. So similarly to what I just described in New York, there were rebels, Extinction Rebellion members in the UK who were vegans and animal justice activists who raised the issue, as I did in New York and others in New York did, about this kind of glaring omission, given the impacts of so-called animal agriculture. And as I understand the story from some of the principals who helped launch Animal Rebellion, that Roger Hallam, who also is a vegan, tapped some of the people that were raising these issues and said, who he knew personally, and said, why don't you explore creating a parallel or sister organization that would incorporate animal justice issues and the environmental impacts therein. So Animal Rebellion, there was an initial meeting in June of 2019, gathering of folks in London, primarily from the UK, but and beyond. Some of you may be familiar with the Animal Rights March, which has become a global institution sponsored by Surge and founder Ed Winters, also known as Earthling Ed. And Ed very skillfully, in my opinion, and generously offered the 2019 March as kind of a launching pad, coming out party for Animal Rebellion. I think what's most significant to know about Animal Rebellion is that it effectively incorporates Extinction Rebellion's 3 demands and 10 principles and values, with some notable differences, particularly, as I note here in demand 1, that to address the climate and economic emergency, CEE, any discussions on doing so skillfully must include the impacts of so-called animal agriculture. These aggressive emission targets, so demand 2 is about reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 0 as soon as possible. Those conversations and attendant actions cannot happen without, it's not possible without incorporating a just and sustainable plant-based food system. And to continue, again, demand 3 is about citizens' assemblies to address these issues at a really grassroots democratic, using a grassroots democratic mechanism of citizen assemblies. And I point to the fact that in the narrative around demand 3 for Animal Rebellion, they point to the impact of corporate lobbying and the impact of corporate capitalism on our lives broadly, I would argue. And again, I speak from the perspective of an American, also someone who operates in New York City, which is the global financial capital, in a country that is the global hegemon and the seat of global corporate capitalism, and I will argue that to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish without looking at the impacts of a system of creating an economic system that's based on the commodification of all life, sentient and non-life, on the planet, and that is predicated on unremitting growth on a finite planet is essentially, in my personal opinion, and what I'm saying is my personal opinion, I want to be really clear about that, it's a fool's errand at the end of the day. I think that again, well-meaning to be beyond politics is the term that that is used to kind of simply frame the third demand, and I agree with that. But beyond electoral politics and addressing an ecocidal system of creating goods and services that has become the global standard for how we as a global civilization operate is not skillful, and that's an entire conversation for another time, and hopefully we can come together again and have those kinds of conversations. But very specifically, the topic today is the imperative of anti-speciesism. So in the first principle of 10 in animal rebellion, the difference is that difference related to Extinction Rebellion is this very explicit commitment to anti-speciesism. We are an anti-speciesist movement. Create a world that protects all species. And I put in this second part because I think it's really important. It's kind of been, without getting into a big narrative on this, it's not widely illuminated or highlighted in the narrative. I think that's an omission that is not contributing to our success. Again, I think it's indicative of in my opinion, a reticence and a fearfulness from swaying from or veering from this very focused, simple, looking to build a big tent, simple demands, building a big tent to get that critical mass of people, and the gold standard academic research and the percentage of the population needed to have an effective nonviolent direct action mobilization is 3.5% of the population. So while I understand the idea of building that big tent, I think, and this is to my mind, the great challenge and the opportunity to create what I would call art forms in our activism that holds both this imperative to be very skillful and very oriented to justice for all sentient beings, while at the same time building that big tent. And that is our work. So I want to play, just to kind of frame what I would argue is some of the most skillful work being done in kind of framing the anti-speciesist justice stance by a fellow American, Jonathan Dickstein, who's a PhD student at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he and his colleagues have written some really wonderful academic papers on this topic. Jonathan does a great job. This is a 6-minute video outlining the three-tiered framing of activism that situates, he talks about veganism, but by extension, so veganism is at the individual, behavior change level. We're talking in Animal Rebellion more about at the, systems level. So we talk about the plant-based food system. So by extension, you can kind of insert plant-based food system here. But I'm going to play this video and then we can talk a little bit about this too.
Hi, this is a brief presentation on a 3-tier model for animal advocacy, which I believe most coherently situates veganism within that advocacy. It's very short. I'm leaving out many details in 5 minutes, but if you have any questions or concerns, please leave them below. So the top tier of this model identifies an ethos, an overarching understanding of justice, and that is one of total liberationism. And total liberationism supports the identification of and resistance to all forms of unjust inequality and oppression of all sentient beings by other sentient beings. So total liberationism implies a certain kind of objective, and that objective is total liberation, which expectedly is the freeing of all sentient beings, human and non-human, from all forms of inequality and oppression perpetrated by other sentient beings. I think that's a general ethos everyone can get on board with. Now, there are different types of discrimination that are inflicted upon certain sentient beings, and while they overlap in many ways, there are reasonable means to identify them individually. And we see that in the identification of discrimination based on sex as sexism, race as racism, and so on. And at the 2nd-tier model, there are these individual sites of oppression and corresponding fronts of resistance. And along there, you have things like sexism, and hence anti-sexism, racism, anti-racism, ableism, anti-ableism, and so on, with nationality, religion, age, etc. Now, for animal advocates, there is this discrimination, this oppression based on species categorization alone, and that is known as speciesism. And at the 2nd tier, speciesism exists as the form of oppression, with anti-speciesism as the movement of resistance. And by putting anti-speciesism here and highlighting it, non-human animals become visible. Very much they become visible as marginalized populations, as oppressed populations, and, to put it simply, a concern for social justice. Now, in order to resist, there needs to be tactics, tools, and strategies. And this is the 3rd tier. And at the 3rd tier, we see patterns of action that can be utilized by any of those operating under any of those sites at the 2nd tier in resistance to that oppression. And here, veganism, as I'm framing it, is not an ideology, it's not a philosophy, it's not a system of thought at all. It's simply conduct descriptive. Veganism only denotes a pattern of action of abstaining from the use and consumption of animals and animal products. Now, what specifically that covers is not so important at the moment. What is important is how the ism of veganism ceases to operate as a kind of philosophy, but simply as a pattern of action, the way we might think of terms like fanaticism or even cannibalism, right? Cannibalism doesn't denote an ideology, it just denotes a pattern of action. And I believe that while this might go against our inherited thinking about what veganism signifies, it actually more coherently places veganism within a framework and also makes it a tool available to those operating in other social justice movements to use it in opposition to oppression. So for those fighting against labor exploitation, the exploitation of slaughterhouse workers, veganism is a tool. For those fighting against environmental racism, veganism is a tool. For those fighting against the sexism that is inherent to, say, the flesh industry itself, veganism is a tool. And here, by letting this tool being used, letting this tool of veganism being used by everyone across that spectrum, because it's just a pattern of action, not a system of thought, it becomes more amenable to them, and also it highlights how it's being used by those working for animals. And through it, I believe we can generate much more solidarity among those in human justice movements for the non-human animal cause. So that's basically how the framework works. It goes from total liberationism to anti-speciesism, and then veganism as one tactic among many others. In closing, I'll just say I know how this might rub against our immediate sensibilities to think of veganism as being everything, right? As being what I call big veganism, or the philosophy and the way of life, all of it. And this is very much a wonderful idea, and the way in which the founders of the term veganism understood it. But they also where the language of total liberation and speciesism didn't exist. And I think in order to communicate the non-human animal cause, and also to make veganism actually coherent, actually something specific and understandable to most people, it makes the most sense purely operating as a pattern of action, and not as some overarching framework. So anyway, that's the model. If you have any questions, like I said, or concerns, I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Philip. You can go ahead and share your screen there now.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, James. So one quick comment before this is a schematic from Jonathan on the model that he described. He used the word consumption, and I would say that with regard to, say, the plant-based food system, that would be specifically consumption of animal food products. But I'm going to invite people to consider, because we're talking about, anti-speciesism, that's consumption conceived more broadly. So people like Roger Yates who's a great vegan activist. He's from the UK, but now based in Dublin. Some of you may have encountered him in his work. About breeding, using, and killing as of sentient beings for any purpose, as a kind of a simple and direct way to describe consumption, what I'm calling consumption more broadly. So in Jonathan and his colleagues' framing, as he just described, I think total liberation as being the ultimate ethical horizon, ethical political horizon. It's so crucial to really, in my mind, it's like eyes on the prize. Like, what are we actually doing here? What collectively, as a global community of all sentient beings, realizing that our lives depend on a functioning ecosystem, among human beings certainly, that there can't be a siloed approach to creating and maintaining a viable ecosystem and viable, by extension, viable institutions by which, and there's a dynamic interplay between those two ideas and institutions, that it can't be, it doesn't happen in isolation, and we can't think about it in isolation and expect to be effective. So I just think, and I'm interested to chat some more about this, in the Q&A and discussion, because I think this is a really powerful framing in and of itself, and specifically with regard to animal rebellion activism. So, and I share this quote from John Simbon-Matsu. So he's the editor of this book, Critical Theory and Animal Liberation. And I'll take the opportunity, and again, everything that I'm saying is my personal opinion. I don't speak for anyone essentially but myself. And and that given the profoundly entrenched speciesist, ethos in the culture into which we were born, that anti-speciesism and so a conservative maintaining that culture is inherently a conservative enterprise, that anti-speciesism by extension is an inherently progressive left space and enterprise, and I don't think, in my opinion, and I'm interested in what other people have to say, I don't see that as being in a contradiction to Animal Rebellion's interest in being beyond politics or being avoiding partisan politics. And why I share this quote, I've shared it in some of my writings and quite widely, because it speaks to the transmaterial, if you will, impacts of assuming the role of the oppressor, in this case specifically with regard to other animals, for we are animals as well. So I'll just read it briefly. In oppressing our kin, other animals, we become estranged from ourselves, placing ourselves in perpetual flight from our own embodied desiring, suffering, and potentially rational selves. And this, it's really important in my mind to speak briefly to the fact that it's this dynamic that is why the anti-speciesist position is so crucially important to as a countervailing force to what is effectively a reductionist, materialist, mechanical way, a largely mechanical way of being in the world that is born of the world that's been created by the scientific method, and I'm not opposed to science, but there's a continuum, and at some point science becomes what's called scientism, right? And that, I see a lot of, for example, in regard to climate and economic emergency, ecological emergency, excuse me, folks trying to do large-scale techno fixes, because that's the way we think about operating in the world, solving problems with enhanced technology. And I think it's misguided. I mean, there's diminishing returns come into play on a profound level as one scales. I mean, the idea in this specific instance about, using technology to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at scale, while I would love to think that that could work, and that perhaps it could be pursued with some amount of resources being devoted to it, but to kind of perhaps, and I'm not committed to that, but to hinge our hopes on that and to devote massive, an overwhelming amount of resources to that, I think is foolish. So I think particularly with regard to anti-speciesism, the transmaterial impacts that must be considered here, in my opinion, are crucial, and it's where Animal Rebellion can be a voice and a guiding light in the global social justice community, of which animal justice is a part. So towards that end, this is a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who's an American and also happens to be, like myself, was a native Bostonian. And I like this quote. It was shared with me by one of my Buddhist teachers, actually. So I'll just read it briefly. A work of love and beauty will not come to order, cannot be compounded by the best rules, but is always a new and incalculable result, like health, don't rattle your rules in our ears. We must behave as we can. And why I like this quote and what stands behind it and why I think it's applicable is that, you know, the reality of the situation. So thinking about the rules that I mentioned, if you will, to use that term broadly, of creating, you know, a critical mass of the population being involved in nonviolent direct action. I think there are limits to that based on the speciesist, the profoundly speciesist culture in which we operate. Meaning, you know, while I would love to think there would exist 3.5% of the global population that is vegan, that could be mobilized towards this end, you know, I don't believe that that's true yet. And it ignores the fact that the reality of our having to educate and move people from the profound impacts of speciesism that's so ingrained to an anti-speciesist view. And that, by extension, is as much as generating that critical mass, while it would be wonderful to do that, and I hope we get there, in the immediate term, to be actually effective, we need to be doing other things than simply recruiting for that critical mass that's going to be, you know, have the impact of gumming up the works and forcing governments to address the climate and ecological emergency with all of their resources, right? So going back to the framing and continuing with these comments, going back to the framing from Dick Stein, patterns of action, education, as I was just saying, you know, because there's so much, I'm preaching to the choir saying this to any animal activists, animal justice activists in the room, and I'm sure there are more than a couple, about the profound level of misinformation, combined with the reactivity that comes from people feeling like they're being threatened, you know, things that are, you know, food is necessary for survival. It's food, you know, and food choices as a global civilization have come to, you know, envision food that includes animal products has a convening power. It's how we build community. It's an expression of love. All the charges that come with this, right, make it it's why it's so damn hard to do what we do, you know? So education, I think, is just a crucially important pattern and action for animal rebellion. Influencing legislation, and I want to just speak briefly about this. I'm involved personally in the USA as a nonprofit. It's actually two organizations. One's more education, called Liberation 360. Animal Agriculture Fairness Alliance, the other half of the house is the way I think about it, is involved in lobbying the US government to end animal agriculture subsidies and bailouts that literally wipe out all the gains of our advocacy here in the US, meaning the number of animals, despite the growth of number of people who identify as anti-speciesist or vegan, the availability of plant-based food products, the growing awareness, speaking about my my fur babies, I call them, the greyhound industry is dying in the United States. There was a referendum in the last election last fall in the state of Florida to end greyhound racing, which effectively, because such a concentration of the remaining greyhound racing tracks were in the state of Florida, and it passed. So it's illegal as of, I think, January 1, 2022, greyhound racing will cease to exist in Florida, which means it effectively has ended in the United States. So all of these very positive things are happening, but with regard to the number of animals killed for food specifically, the numbers continue to go up because of these subsidies and bailouts, right? Then coming more to some of the things, and again, collaborative, because the reality of the brute fact that we have to address is that we are still relatively small in number, and our growth is happening, but it's, you know, it's challenging. It's slower than I would like. So to be a partner, build alliances. And I think if you're interested in people, someone who talks about this really skillfully is Jake Conroy, who's known as a Cranky Vegan. He has a YouTube channel under that name, Cranky Vegan. And he talks, he's got a depth of, you know, experience and skill, was part of the Shack 7. So he sacrificed his freedom for the movement. And I put a lot of credence in what he has to say. And he talks about the crucial importance of building alliances with organizations in which, and movements that we can move towards that critical mass, engage in nonviolent direct action that's going to help, you know, draw our attention and force governments around the world, you know, and I would argue their corporate paymasters, frankly, to sit up and take notice, right? By extension, again, a big from Jake, pressure campaigns, you know, here in the US, and it may have even extended to North America, Soren could probably say, or it may even be global, but there's been a big win on a pressure campaign in the fur industry. Saks Fifth Avenue, which is a large boutique retailer here in North America, high-end luxury brand and outlet, has committed to end their, you know, use of fur in their clothing, and continuously scanning the field, using our experience to identify, incorporate opportunities for positive impact, to be creative and dynamic. And I see, you know, Animal Rebellion doing that, particularly, you know, the forcing function of the pandemic. You know, it was a bit more difficult to be in the streets. There's been online actions, any number of alternative sites of resistance, you know, and attendant action, right? Really important. So this is a favorite quote from the French writer Blaise Pascal. We do not display greatness by going to one extreme, but in touching both at once and in filling all the intervening space. And why I like this and why I think it's applicable is that I conceive of the equally important imperative to create for impact. The big impact that we can have as Animal Rebellion is in realizing that plant-based food system, in terms of the mechanics of addressing ecological, you know, degradation broadly conceived, right? So that would be one extreme, if you will. And then the other extreme being an acknowledgement that is intrinsic in the anti-speciesist position that consciousness, sentience is ineffably profound, and that to be sentient, to be conscious, is to be a member of the moral community, and that must be honored. So I'm going to wrap on my comments there. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm really looking forward to what I'm sure will be an engaged conversation. For more information on Animal Rebellion, please go to animalrebellion.org. Thanks so much for your attention. Again, apologies for that tech hiccup. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Tracy.